Welcome to Unexpected Points. I'm your host, Kevin Cole. I have a very special guest today, Ryan Paganetti. He was, I should say, the assistant linebackers coach for the Eagles for the last few years. He did game management stuff there. He'd been with the Eagles for a combined 6 years. I wanted to talk to Ryan. Not only does he have great insights, on the football side of things, on the coaching side of things, but he has analytics bona fides here with the game management side. And of course, Ivy League guy. So we just automatically pencil you into the analytics bucket, right?
Yeah, of course.
I was going to,
Put me in the nerd category.
Yeah, there you go. Well, hey, if you can get your feet in both realms, then at least when the inevitable "you never played football" sort of thing comes up, you don't have to worry. You don't have to worry about that challenge that many of us nerds have to worry about on the outside.
I still got a little bit of that to some degree. No matter what, yeah.
Well, different levels of football, but we'll talk about a bunch of stuff here. I want to go through some of your career progression, and then also go through maybe like in a typical season, the setup, the game by game sort of thing, and then adjustments there. So why don't we just start with background for you as far as how you got into coaching and how you got into later in your career, I guess, doing more of the game management stuff.
Mm-hmm. So for me, I was actually a pretty competent running back coming out of high school, and I went to Dartmouth to be a running back. I was sort of, I guess, trying to mold myself as a Danny Woodhead or whatnot. But unfortunately, I got there and I had a significant hip issue and a significant shoulder issue. And I ended up having to get a labral surgery on my hip, a labral surgery on my shoulder. Some other things came up and it basically just like crushed my career. And I had always really been interested in coaching. And in particular, I'd played a lot of Madden. Like I just thought like I really enjoyed that stuff. And I had a great relationship. So I was at Dartmouth, but I was from Massachusetts originally. And I had a great relationship with the coaches that I had been with in high school. And so I sort of oriented my school schedule so that I could like take classes 2 days a week. And then I would actually commute back to Massachusetts. And I started coaching while I was still in college. And I had a ton of fun with that and like just really sort of developing my skills from that standpoint. And at one point I'm like, I think I want to be a high school coach long-term, like there's less pressure. You can do whatever you want. Like if you want to be Kevin Kelly at Pulaski Academy and just do outrageous stuff, like right. The media is not questioning you or anything like that. So I didn't really think that, the NFL was a possibility. And I was sort of fortunate to get a little bit of a connection and I was able to get an internship with the Cowboys before my senior year in college. And that was like in the scouting department and they didn't really have much analytical stuff going on there. So I kind of helped out with scouting and analytical stuff and just getting my feet into the league and getting experience. I think that was like a really great opportunity for me. And it like sort of convinced me that like, if there was an opportunity to get into the NFL, like I definitely wanted to do it. Like, this is what a lot of my classmates, I guess, at Dartmouth, they were like going through Wall Street and those sorts of routes. And I'm like, yeah, that'd be like cool to like make a lot of money or all that. But, for me, like if I can do something in football, even if it's as a player personnel person, as a coach, as an analytics person, like I was like, I'll do anything. If you want me to drive somebody to the airport, I'll do that. Like if you want me to fill up water bottles, sounds good. Like, and so then I was fortunate to, after school, I got an internship with the Eagles, and that was actually like Chip Kelly's last season. And it was great for me to like get a lot of experience, not only just in the NFL and get my foot in, but like to be able to witness like multiple different coaching staffs early on in my career and to just see like very different approaches, whether it's like personnel or coaching or scheme, like 3-4, 4-3, and just to be able to see like how people can have just like totally different approaches. And, it from the first few years, I would say for most people, like you're almost like a grad student / like studying your PhD in football or analytics. Like you're just trying to learn to some degree, just because at that level, at the NFL level, like these guys are experts in their field. I mean, most of these guys have been coaching for 10,000 hours or, they've been scouting players for 25, 30 years. And so at least starting out, I was more just like in the background, sort of learning and seeing if there was ways I could help out and sort of just doing whatever I could to, try to help the Eagles win football games.
Well, let me jump in for a second here. So you mentioned the internships that you got with the Cowboys. So at that point in time, Garrett had been around forever, right? So he was the coach there, I assume, at that point in time. So I just anecdotally, like talking, whether it be on the scouting side or even on the coaching side, a lot of it is networking connections you may have. You may know someone who's there. I mean, some of it is kind of like a wide open interview process, obviously. And it seems like, Ivy League types are probably disproportionately represented versus players, right? In the NFL. So was any of that part of what you were looking at, is maybe looking at guys who were either former Dartmouth coaches who were working somewhere that you could work through, or was it more of an open thing when you work with the Cowboys and the Eagles?
Um, at the end of the day, I was like just trying for any opportunity. Like I grew up a Patriots fan, and I was like, if any of these 32 teams want to give me a shot, like I'm happy to do it. And so like just reaching out, sending, like my resume, and, I really was offering to work for free because I'm like, look, there's so many people that want these jobs. And the from the team side, like they can theoretically like suppress wages because they know that they're going to have like 100,000 applicants if they post an analyst job or a coaching assistant job or something like that online. And so I sort of understood that there was like a sacrifice to be made early on. And I'm like, look, you don't have to pay me anything. I just wanted, an opportunity to prove myself. And I think that was like helpful because at the end of the day, like the risk, like even if these teams didn't really even have like an opportunity available, they're just like, well, like it's not like it's a significant burden for us to add somebody. And maybe this person, they went to Dartmouth, maybe they have some creative ideas or they can do some interesting things that we're not already doing. So but at the end of the day, I was like, I'll do whatever for any team. That was sort of my mindset.
Yeah. Okay. So you were with the Eagles. Then you mentioned Chip Kelly was there. You kind of work your way up the ladder. I mean, what are like the differentiating factors for someone moving their way up the ladder beyond willingness to do anything and everything for no money, which is probably that's like getting your foot in the door, right? So yeah.
Yes. I kind of looked at it like, all right, well, like I could have gone to grad school and paid money, or I could have, pursued something and paid significant money, or I actually did get paid, but it was more just like presenting myself as somebody willing to do it for free.
Yeah.
But I think just, treating everybody with respect and, showing that you're like grateful for the opportunity. Like, so when I got to the Eagles, it was March right before the draft. And kind of weird timing, like just because particularly I was like helping out on the player personnel and a little bit of like analytical side. And
because you were doing scouting stuff with the Cowboys.
Yes. And so my mindset was like, I'm not going to do anything here that is going to make them want to get rid of me. So, and I'm like, I'm going to just, could be a once in a lifetime opportunity. Like, I know, how lucky I am to get my foot in the door. So early on, I actually like got pulled into somebody's office and they're like, so they had me clocking in like hourly. And they're like, do you know that you worked 122 hours last week? And I'm like, well, I didn't even keep track, honestly, but like, just like this mindset of just like, I always was like, you know what, if I lose some sleep here early on in my career, like, it is what it is. But, I don't want to be sitting there regretting an opportunity that like, I didn't give it my best shot. And I think for me, just sort of beginning to like work my way up was just, developing relationships with coaching staff members or personnel staff members. And sort of a lot of times these guys have no idea even like what data they have access to, or like what somebody that has like a more technical background can do to help them. Like they might be doing like they might spend 5 hours going through an entire season trying to find all these like 3x1 bunches by the Giants. And they don't even know that like with their Pro Football Focus data, that I can pull it up for them in like 45 seconds.
Right.
And so just like being able to like show different, staff members that like, hey, there's ways things can be streamlined. And, even just like having discussions, like sitting down at lunch or dinner and like hearing, their perspectives of like, hey, this is why I hate analytics, or this is why I hate that. And being able to like, get to the point where you could sort of explain to them like how actually like we are factoring that in. Like, cause a lot of times we'd be like, you're not factoring in this or factoring in that. It's like, no, we kind of are. So for me, it was just, I guess just, I would say like relationships was important. And in particular, when the team decided to make a change and move on from Chip Kelly, I was fortunate that there was like staff members that were retained or people in like front office or other positions. And they had like sort of seen, that I was just willing to help out and do whatever. And I think that was like what allowed me to stick around, because realistically, a lot of times when you have like a major change at the top, like most people kind of get swapped out, and a lot of, staffs, they just go with like a fresh start. So I was sort of fortunate because of some relationships that I built and, just sort of treated everybody as well as I could, that I was able to stick around.
Yeah. I mean, essentially, I think I was reading about, I think it was Robert Saleh was talking about things that he could do when he first started. And it was a lot of that sort of thing. Like he could come in, kind of show people how to, use his skills as a computer folk to come in there and like show people how to do things. And maybe that's gives you a little bit of less replaceability maybe than some other people if you can do that stuff quickly and efficiently. Yeah, the 2015 season, that must have been an interesting one. I mean, I'm thinking back now. I remember the rumors were out there that Chip was going to trade for like every draft pick for the next 15 years for Marcus Mariota, and that everything else that ended up going on there. What was it like then being an analyst and like the structure of the Eagles? I assume the Eagles were viewed from the outside as being this completely unique take on the NFL and the way Chip Kelly was doing things. Do you think it was very traditional inside the building there? Is it's similar at all to kind of how things have grown in the NFL?
I think that, to this day, some of the stuff that Chip was doing was so impressive. And I have a ton of respect for him, because he really he didn't care what anyone else was doing. Like if he felt like something was backed by data or made a lot of sense, like he was going to pursue that. And like, for an example, he was having the scouts like video prospective like players, like, so the scouts would go around to colleges, meet with all the players and whatever and talk to them and film them, whatever. And so part of the response, Trip had a massive investment in sports science, and like he really believed in like, okay, if
he was like supposedly tracking everyone's sleep and everything else.
Like sleep, heart rate variability, injury risk prevention, hydration, but that also like came into play with like working out players that were like prospective free agents, or looking at college players. So this really unique thing that he had guys doing, and I think it was really sharp, was he had the scouts go around and basically take like college players through these like basic movement screens, and they would like film it. And so then they would bring back that film and show it to like the sports science guys. So like if they had, the sports science guys were like very involved in the player selection process from the standpoint of like they could assess like some kind of dysfunction in the player's body. Like say you couldn't bring the player in for like a physical or whatnot, but you had all this film showing like, okay, like there's something going on with their left ankle, there's something going on with their and like basically sort of projecting some level of like risk of like, all right, does this player have certain attributes that are fixable, or is there certain aspects of like their biomechanics that are like critical flaws that may show up over the course of their career, where they're just like, okay, they had a couple injuries in college and they're just going to continue to get hurt because something is like really off. And I think you saw, like, if you look at Football Outsiders, like adjusted games lost and things like that, like Chip's 3 years in Philadelphia, like the team was incredibly healthy. Like, and it was very surprising too, because the total snaps that the team was playing was like the most in the league because of the tempo that he was operating at. And I think now you see more and more teams like investing in the sports science aspect of things. And in particular, you see that sort of play out with the preseason in particular, because most teams have realized, like, why are we risking players like playing in a preseason game when it's relatively meaningless? And I think that the person that sort of really set off this new tradition of like barely playing your starters at all or none was when Sean McVay did a couple years ago. Mm-hmm. And I want to say that like all their top players did not even step foot on the field. And then they had a very healthy season. And, you know, like the way the NFL is such a copycat league, people saw that and they're like, okay, if that team like did nothing in the preseason and they ended up very healthy, they had a successful year, like we got to do that too. And I think so you saw a lot of teams like sort of emulating that model. And I think there's always like a little bit of a pushback from like coaches. They're like, oh, well, these guys need to get ready to play, or this guy, this guy needs reps or live reps. And I think there'll always be a little bit of a battle there, but like it's sort of trended more towards, avoiding injuries at all costs in that sense, or scaling back, the amount of practice time you're doing during training camp, or, keeping track of a guy's GPS data and being like, okay, he spiked a lot with a high workload day yesterday. Let's like back him off and pull him out halfway through practice or give him a day off. And I think that you're seeing most teams are like trying to implement something like that at this point, but there are some like old school teams that are like, no, we're going to have the toughest training camp of all. And like, we're going to run laps and like do up downs or whatever. And I think it's just sort of interesting. You do see like variations and things like that, but there's definitely been like a movement in that direction.
Oh yeah. No, I mean, we've gotten outsiders have gotten a little taste of that via Hard Knocks, because a few years ago when it was the Browns who were on there was this conflict between Hugh Jackson, and I guess it was mostly, I'm trying to think of who it was. I remember Freddie Kitchens was in there, but I don't think he was the main like antagonist here. But it was like, can we get guys to dress at least when we're giving them days off? Because they were giving days off, and they got shit about giving days off to guys like Myles Garrett, who was very young, or I think it was Duke Johnson, who had a lot of like soft tissue injuries and things like that. And then even in this year's Hard Knocks, in the first episode, they were mentioning monitoring, I guess is what Dak was doing, and taking him out, but he didn't want to be taken out on that sort of thing. So it's probably become, a fairly common thing there. How do you deal with the pushback? I guess that would be an interesting question there, because it's seen. I mean, I remember the cesspool that is like Twitter, when Garrett was getting this day off, people were just making this big to do about it, despite the fact that I think it was going into his second year. So he got injured as a rookie, and he had some ankle and soft tissue injuries before that. Like, how do you deal with that within the building, or is the noise not as bad within the building as we're seeing on the outside?
I think the noise is less in the building. It would mostly be coming from like coaching people, but the front office people love that, because like I've noticed that the front office people like have very little weight on preseason snaps, and they're just like, keep everyone healthy. Like, I don't want to have to deal with this guy we paid $12 million having like a Liz Frank injury in week 2 of preseason. Like, let's get him out there week 1, and like if they're a little bit rusty, fine, but at least we're not like losing guys in meaningless games. And I think just from the top, like, if the owner and the head coach and the general manager are on board with it, like people sort of just respect it. Like, you might have gossip and like complaints here and there, but for the most part, if the people at the top are on board with something, like, you kind of just roll with it.
Yeah. I mean, we didn't even have a preseason last season, right? And things didn't completely fall apart, although I'm sure there are some complaints could be made. And, I want to go back to one thing that you mentioned about, because I found it really interesting about this, the imaging and the data that was being collected on players. You mentioned from when Chip Kelly was there. What I think is hard sometimes from an analyst hat here. I know that obviously people have institutional knowledge that can tell them if certain movements will lead to injury, this and that. But then if it's new data that's being collected, and I think it's probably happening with a lot of teams with the tracking data and things like that right now, is you can't really model and test it very well necessarily. You're using more of this, maybe logic / institutional knowledge / whatever to make an assessment on that. I mean, I don't know if from that specifically when you were with the Eagles, but how often does that come up where it's like you can't necessarily make confident predictions, even though you have this new data which can be very valuable?
Yeah, I think sort of from the sports science standpoint, I think just sort of relying on like peer-reviewed studies and opportunities where like it wasn't just like it almost wasn't new data. It was just more so like basic assessments, and in just the sense that like it was sort of like a no stone unturned mentality of you're just like, it's just an additional tool. Like, it's not going to be the final tool and everything, but like, okay, look, like this person has significant discrepancies in this this testing model. Like, I don't know if you've heard of like the functional movement screen, but that's like a pretty standard protocol now where you basically perform like something like 7 to 10 movements and you get a score. And there's been some pretty significant data supporting like if you have a terrible score in the functional movement screen, like your odds of encountering a significant injury are much higher. So I think
when is that being collected? Is that on like these team visits? Is that something that everyone's doing at the combine on the
yeah, I
download
think
that's not public? Or
yeah, I think it sort of depends. Like we would do it at team visits, and I think some teams, they'll get the doctors to take a look at the guys at the combine. The players are so busy at the combine, sometimes you don't really have enough time to do things like that. But in particular, like the team visits is big when you do like a top 30 visit. But to give you like another example, like I think there's a little bit of a balance too, where just like sometimes players feel like it's a little bit intrusive if you're like gathering so much data. Like
there's only a negative to it, right? Like, and
well,
it's hard to envision, like, if you're a great player, you played well, you're a top prospect,
yeah.
like it's like, are you the I guess it's like disproportionate risk, right? If you're going to fall based upon this information.
Right. Yeah. And you'll see like some players these days like aren't getting weighed, or like they don't want their height taken, or they don't want to do workouts, because the only thing that can happen is like something bad. But even just like on a daily basis, when I was with the Eagles, we had players doing testing for like hydration. So like urine testing, and they would do things like they would wake up in the morning and they'd strap this heart rate variability monitor on them, and like in a couple minutes be told like, here's your heart rate variability. And like, these are things that there's a lot of like promising data suggesting that like, yes, this information is very useful, but for some of these players, they're like, what am I doing? Like I'm just sitting wearing this thing, or like I'm peeing in a cup every day. Like I don't want to do this. And it's just like, if you're presenting something new to like veteran players, it's a little bit different than like college, where like some of those sorts of behaviors are a lot more like standardized, and you can't like, I don't know, the political like sway that college players have is so much less than in the NFL, where you have some like 34-year-old veteran who's like, I'm not peeing in a cup. Like, what do we no? And so like, I think there's always like a balance there, and to some degree, but for the most part with the Eagles, there was a lot of players that were like pretty receptive to this stuff. They're like, all right, well, if my hydration test shows that like I'm dehydrated, my chance of a soft tissue injury may be higher at practice. So like I can hydrate more at practice today. And just little things like that, I think, are just generally useful, even if you don't have like very exact data, like, okay, consume like 18.7 ounces of water and you're good. It's like, it's just more like, generally speaking, like, all right, we can use some intuition here that, like if you're showing up as dehydrated, like you probably want to drink water, and just little things like that, I think were definitely helpful. And it was always nice to have players that were receptive. Like, and I try to tell people, like with Tom Brady, for example, like one of like the reasons I think that, his value goes beyond the field is just like the way that he is so obsessive about everything off of the field, and that the impact that has on like his teammates and the people around the organization, when they're just like, well, if Tom's going to bed at 8:30, or Tom's taking care of his diet or getting massages or doing everything possible to be better, like who am I to be like some rookie or some second year player and just like go party during the season or go screw around and stuff like that. I think that there's just like a positive externality of them sort of seeing like a leader of the team who's like totally bought into like fully investing in their health. And I think it sort of like impacts the rest of the team as well.
Yeah. No, I can see that. I mean, it probably is happening. Actually, I don't know. This is a little bit more speculation, but it's probably even happening with things like the vaccinations that are going on in the NFL now. If you can like pitch and get the quarterback in a lot of cases on board, but even another very respected player, whoever it may be, bought in first. I mean, can that be like a strategy then, if you're trying to get people, is to target one person and maybe pitch them a little bit more often than trying to get other people on board?
Yeah, I think just to some degree, a lot of it I think is like self-driven, where you just have some players that just like, they just have this mindset that I'm going to do whatever it takes. So we had guys like Darren Sproles or Malcolm Jenkins, or even like Nelson Aguilar, for example, that just whatever it took to be better, like they were going to do it. And I think that just the more players like you have like that in the building, the better. And I think it definitely shows up with the vaccines as well, where you just there is, the numbers in the last like month or two have like really improved in terms of like the buy-in and things like that. And I think it's more just like people seeing like, okay, like that player who's better than me and he's like a 10-year veteran, he got the vaccine and he's playing good and he's not having any side effects. Like I got to do that. You know what I mean? Like, I think just seeing people playing and even just being like spending all this time in training camp every day with these guys, I think that can definitely like be something to help convince guys. And I mean, I think you do have a lot of teams like now, like 90+% vaccinations. So should be interesting to see how that kind of all plays out with the season.
Yeah. I mean, I know I saw, I think it was the Vikings who had a lot of top players who weren't doing it. So yeah, it can really work back and forth on that. Okay. So let's talk about your transition into coaching. So you mentioned that you were initially like, I'm gonna, Kevin Kelly, never punt, or maybe combination of that, Friday Night Lights, maybe also a little bit of that in there. So that was going to be your life. You used your nerd credentials to get in through that route. How did you make the transition over to coaching?
So I'd say I always sort of felt like I didn't want to like exclusively be a coach. Like I wanted to be like, my mindset was like, I wanted to be like the first guy who was legitimately a coach and legitimately an analytics guy. Cause I think some of these guys have obviously the coaches have embraced analytics, but somebody that is like all in on analytics type deal. So when I was coaching in high school, I think I sort of had like my first taste of like, hey, I could really do something from a analysis perspective that could like translate on the field, like when I'm installing something. So for example, I was sort of in charge of like our punt return unit when I was in high school, when I was coaching this high school team. And I have this little pet peeve that I think it's borderline insane how frequently teams like muff punts or have situations where punts like bounce off a player's leg because they're like blocking the gunner and the frequency in which like an absolutely critical game-changing play happens. Like I think San Francisco is an example, like when they were playing in the playoffs with like Harbaugh, the guy like muffed 2 points or something like that in a playoff game. But I just think that people just drastically underestimate the frequency at which muffed punts are occurring. And if you don't have a guy that you really feel confident about, like you should probably not return those or even attempt to catch them like much more frequently. If it's windy, if it's rainy, like, maybe you lose a few more yards because the ball bounces, but there's other ways you can handle it. Maybe you have your punt returner like go block one of the gunners as well to, let the ball go in the end zone and things like that. But just sort of like taking the data and like I was sort of studying our own team in high school. And what was interesting was like we had nobody at the high school level who was remotely competent at catching punts. Like it was like probably at least a 20% chance on our team that it was going to get muffed. And I'm like, we're not going to even return these things. So I started thinking to myself, I'm like, just the operation time of, long snapping and like the level of talent of high school punters. Like, I feel like we could probably block some of these things. And like, I don't even want to risk anyone going near that ball because I don't want to be blamed for us fumbling or muffing or whatever. So what we were doing, and this was like, so I'm installing like my punt blocks and basically we put all 11 guys, we were like our 11 fastest guys out on the field and they just all exclusively just rushed full speed. Like we basically would just honor the fact like, okay, if they split 2 guys out wide, we'd have to put 2 out there. But for the most part, we just had no returner and we just sent every single guy selling out and we blocked like 7 punts in 7 games. And I was like, like, I think I might be onto something here. And I just like felt like that was like my first like foray into like coaching and like having something with like data and like putting it into play. And I thought that was like exciting for me. And that was sort of like motivating for the future. And then, so I would always follow like the analytics community. And in particular, like I mentioned in the Forbes article, like Brian Burke is like, I have so much respect for Brian Burke that like, I just put him about as high up as you possibly could. And like, I talked to Brian a little bit and he helps me out at different times when I had questions and there'd be things that came up in 2019 or 2020 and it would be some sort of game situation and I would be thinking about it. And then I'd realize like after Googling it that Brian already wrote about it in like 2008. Like,
for those who don't know, Brian Burke, who's at ESPN now, he had the name changed of it, but he had a blog. I think it was Advanced. It may have been Advanced NFL Analytics, and they changed it to Advanced Football Analytics. So that's exactly one of those things. Anytime you have a question about something, you're like, oh, I wonder how this affects something, and then you start doing some research. You're like, oh yeah, Brian looked into that question. And I think what's great about his blog in particular is he's not like a data scientist by training or anything like that. He didn't have fantastic data, but it's pretty like simple sort of insight you can do, as long as you have an approach of looking at the data, using some intuition, using some thinking as far as how things, and maybe not being tied to what people would traditionally do. Right.
Right. Yeah. I think just at the end of the day, at least when I was first kind of getting involved in NFL analytics, like it was always important to just have some sense of like being able to make reasonable assumptions and like trying to use some intuition and logic to be like, this doesn't make sense, or this does make sense, or let's try to simplify this here because things could get really complicated. I mean, you see even now with like win probability models or expected point models, and like you'll see some very, very intelligent people come to like very different conclusions. And I think to some degree that almost like hurts analytics to some degree. Just seeing how one thing says that, and I think some coaches get caught up with this and they're like, okay, well, what's the truth? Because this model says this, or this model says that. And I think for me, particularly with working with Doug Pederson, like being able to like show him like a couple different models that were like showing something similar, or saying like, hey, here's 5 models, but 4 of them said the same thing. Like, you know, I think it was probably like, you can feel pretty good about what you did.
Yeah.
And I think that was always helpful to kind of just like cross-check what you were doing, so you just didn't have some like single model that was like fairly radical or anything like that.
Yeah.
But so I have a little story from my experience with in 2015 that with Chip that I think was kind of, I don't think anyone is familiar with this story. It's just kind of an interesting anecdote, but in terms of like getting into coaching. So I had always had this argument, and I was trying to do this at the high school level, but this coach is like, you're completely insane. But I had this argument that if you were at the end of the first half and the other team was clearly in field goal range, but they had enough time to, you know, run 2-3 plays and try to get a touchdown, that you would just essentially just hold all the receivers or tackle all the receivers to prevent them from attempting to get a touchdown and just take the penalty and force a field goal attempt.
And how much time left are we talking about?
So like say, I don't know, 8 seconds, 12 seconds.
Yeah.
Theoretically could have done it multiple times
at
the time. And so say there's like 8 seconds left and the other team's at the 10-yard line going in, and you could like, all right, they're going to get a field goal at minimum. They're clearly going to try to score a touchdown. So like if you sit there and on the snap, you basically grab all the eligible receivers and prevent them from going anywhere, or even like tackle them or whatever. Like they have to kick a field goal. Like that's the
right. They'll get another play even if there's 0 seconds left, but no one's going to take that.
And so say you're at like the 15 or the 10, or like for the most part, unless it's like the 1 or 2 yard line, teams aren't going to go. They're not going to go for that. Right. And even if they do go for that, that's like fairly risky too. But
well, you lose you also lose the benefit going forward in that situation, because you're not pinning the other team deep, because it's the end of the half. So it's less valuable to go for it at the 4th and 1 at the end of the half than it is at another point during the game. But anyway, go ahead.
Right. So I like sort of brought this up with some coworkers in Philly, and they're like, all right, we're not doing that. Like, so, but sure enough, what happened is in week 3 of that season, we're playing, I think it was week 3, we're playing the Jets. And it was something like 12 seconds left from the 17 or something like that. The exact number I don't have. Maybe somebody could look this up. But Fitzpatrick threw a touchdown at the end of the first half to Brandon Marshall. I think it was Brandon Marshall. And it was the perfect situation that we could have done this strategy of just grabbing all the guys and guaranteeing a field goal. And so fortunately, you know, once that moment happened, we sort of like brought it up to Chip. We're like, you know, hey, you should think about this. Like one thing that we did, and I actually worked with like Dave Giuliani. I know you had him on here at some point. And we sort of like presented that to Chip, like, hey, you know, there's a pretty compelling case here that we could just basically take penalties and, you know, guarantee a 3-point end of half situation for them.
Wait, is this part of like a weekly review thing, or is this?
Yeah, so we had a little bit like later on in the week. We usually like, you know, early on in the week would kind of be more focused on like helping out with game planning stuff, but later on in the week, just sort of reviewing things that happen around the league and sort of like throwing ideas out, or just like bringing up, you know, something that happened with another team, or like they used a timeout here, we would not have used a timeout, et cetera, things like that.
Okay.
And so we sort of brought that up, and he was like very receptive to it. He's like, let's do this. And so they put in like a defense, and it was called like 55 holds. And it was basically like a man cover 2 defense. And on the snap, all the man-to-man guys were basically just going to grab their players. And so people didn't realize that we actually did it in 2015 at the end of the second half. We were playing at Dallas, and we were up by 3, and Des Bryant had just like been crushing us. They were like making a comeback, and we just like couldn't cover them. Like it was hopeless. And they had the ball at like, I don't know, like the 30 or something like that. And Chip just felt good. He's like, if they just, attempt a field goal and we go to overtime, like I'm cool with this, but like I don't want Des Bryant catching a ball in the end zone or something and we go home with a loss. And so there was time left for like 2 plays or whatever. And they called the play, and really, like, I'm not 100% sure it was the best time to call it, but we did it.
And well, the 30 is like, yeah, I mean,
you're
giving him some valuable yardage there.
No, it really probably like wasn't the best, but like, anyways, it happens. And sure enough, like, so Malcolm Jenkins like basically just tackled Jason Witten, and like the commentators like, what the hell is going on? Like, we had like Byron Maxwell like didn't even do it. Like it was like it was just a strange play. And like, I think it was like Sunday Night Football or something. Chris Collinsworth's like, okay, like that was an interesting move by them, like, because no one really knew what was going on. And then they attempted the field goal the next play. They made the field goal, and then we won in overtime. So it was like, oh, it worked because we won. Like hindsight, I was like, but then the next season, so Chip went to San Fran and he ran it 2 times that year. Like he did it against, you should pull up these plays because it was like legendary, but he did it against Carolina, and then he did it against San Fran. He did it against New Orleans, and like Sean Payton and Drew Brees were like losing their mind because they like thought it was like illegal, but there was nothing. I mean, it was completely legal at the time. And then shortly after that, I don't know if it was in season or after the season, they ended up banning it as like some kind of intentional penalty to manipulate clock type situation. But it was sort of funny just like seeing how that sort of played out.
Getting something banned sounds like the nice badge of honor right there.
Yeah.
I thought of something like that had to be banned.
I thought it was awesome that Chip was like cool with doing it and stuff. Like, I don't know if it's banned in college right now, but like if I was a college team, I would do that even more in college because the kickers are so bad. And you have a short field goal from one of the hashes, it's like a crapshoot because it's so far off to the side. But yeah, that was kind of like my first, like ability to like sort of transfer something onto the field. And I was like super excited about it. Like that was like at one point that was like the peak of my life. I'm like, that's the coolest thing ever. But anyway, so I sort of just I basically just presented myself as, when Doug took over, as like, I'm willing to do whatever to help. And Doug had come from Kansas City, where Andy Reid has had this guy Mike Frazier helping him for a really long time. I think he's like the statistical coordinator or something like that. And so as Doug was sort of like building out his staff, he sort of put me in that role where I was like sort of like his like kind of like right hand man for like statistical things. Like if he had like a project or like a question or anything like that, like he would sort of ask me for that sort of stuff. And at the same time, like I was like just had this mentality of like, I'm going to fill in however I can. So I also was like helping out the offensive line and helping out like running backs and linebackers. Like I was just
this is in 2016.
So I was sort of like filling in the blanks, and like to some degree, like I was sort of shaking off like the analytics stigma, because like I would literally be holding a bag at practice for like Brandon Brooks and Jason Kelsey to do like a double team block or whatever, whoever was there at the time. And I'm like, yeah, like that's I was getting thrown around a little bit. Like I almost had to go see the athletic trainers a couple of times because it was like I'm like, probably
I hope you were monitoring your own hydration levels.
Yeah, no, I that was like, sometimes I would be dreading practice because I'm like, oh, it's the day that we do double teams. That's great. I don't even have cleats on, and I'm about to be thrown 30 yards. But I sort of just how things played out. I was helping out Doug during the games in 2016, and like we were going for 4th downs, but like we were like so on converting them. We actually were losing a lot of games, so it was like a lot of the 4th downs we were going for in 2016 were sort of obvious ones because we were losing. And we actually even had a few like semi-controversial like 4th and 2s and stuff that we got stuffed on, and like I was like nervous about it because I'm like, I think coaches are very like biased on like what has happened frequently, like what has happened recently for them. So like if they failed on a couple in a row, they're like, screw that, I don't want to do that. But I think just Doug was always very receptive to like looking at the data, and like I would meet with him the day after the game and sort of like show him like here was the win probability difference. Here was the expected points difference of the decisions that you made. Like, here's one maybe we could have done differently. But like, I was always very respectful about it. I'm like, I'm not telling you what to do. Like, I'm just giving you some information, if this is helpful, and just something to think about. And he was very open to it. I think we had like an amazing owner, Mr. Lurie, who was always very positive with Doug and like encouraging him, like, look, like if you go for fourth downs and you fail, like, that's fine. Like, I trust the data. Like, I believe in this stuff. And I'm always going to support you. And I'm not going to sit here and like get mad at you because you went for a fourth down. So I think just having that mindset where that sort of like put a little bit less pressure on him. And well, anyway, so that second year, so up going into 2017, we had like some staff changes, and there was like an opportunity to basically, formally be like working with the linebackers as like a coaching assistant or whatever. And so that's when I sort of like officially became like a coach. And I think it was like really helpful for me because I was in all the defensive meetings. Like, I continued to like learn a lot in terms of scheme things, and to be able to like sit in like, I don't know, 30, 40 hours worth of, schematic meetings a week. Like, I could find out like things that we were doing, and like be able to come up with more interesting questions, and be able to, find certain things that could more directly impact like game plans, because I was like sitting in the meetings and I understood why they were doing something. And I was able to like question something like, all right, well, if we're doing this because of 12 plays, like I can pull up 142 plays of, something similar. We can look at that. Or, if we're doing this because we're trying to, stop the run game, like, why are we trying to stop the run game if they're running a lot on 2nd and 10, like things like that, I could sort of show the coaches and give them some more specific and useful data, I think.
Yeah. Well, real quick on that. So I know like your framework and your expertise kind of could help you relating to the coaching side of thing. Now, being in those rooms and seeing things more on the coaching side, but I mean, I know you've done some coaching before, but this is on a different level, on a very special, on more of a specialized level. Also, did that change how you thought about not just ideas for how to do analysis, but maybe, how you would think about certain things, where before it was more cut and dried, and now, we get in the quote unquote context. Everything's context, right? Whenever it says,
Yes.
you don't want to do something, it's like, well, what about this? What about this? Have you thought about this? So did that change your philosophy a little bit on that, or did it reinforce in any ways some of the things you've been thinking about?
I think on some issues, like, it definitely sort of gave me a new perspective, and sort of made me rethink a few things. Like, to give you an example, and I'm not sure if any of these models are like capturing this, but just spending time with our like special teams coach, he had sort of discussed how just like blindly, like a lot of these like models will say like, all right, if you punt from like the minus 30-yard line, here's like the net average, and that might like go into a fourth down model for the punt. But
minus 30 being your own
30-yard line. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that's like sort of a lot like, okay, like if you choose to punt, like the average net is 43, whatever, from that yard line. But he had made like a really good point that, if you're punting on 4th and 1 or 4th and 2 or 4th and 3, like that's a different situation than if you're punting on 4th and long. And the main reason being that the returning team has to like honor a fake. And so what happens is you'll see teams when it's a short yardage 4th down punt, like they'll have more players in the box, like in the terminologies, a lot of times like there'll be an 8 box or a 7 box, versus like if it's like 4th and 10, the odds of a fake from the minus 30 are so low that you'll see things like a 6 box where they'll double the gunners.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
And then because of that, the actual net on the punts is a little bit better on 4th and shorts, because like the gunners basically get a more free release, and you sort of have to call certain returns that respect the chance of a fake a lot more. And so like being able to factor that in a little bit, I'm like, okay, well, like if we're attempting like a 4th and 1, 4th and 2, 4th and 3, maybe the net is like 45 yards on the punt, versus if it's 4th and 12, it's 42 yards on the punt. And like just even being able to factor in little things like that, I think did make a difference and made some of the analysis better. Mm-hmm. One thing that sort of I was like reinforced on, and I think just sort of like convinced me even more, towards like what I felt was like, I was like very big into quarterback sneaks. And I felt like, that was maybe the biggest inefficiency, even more than the fourth downs, like in the NFL. And I like spent like my entire like 2017 offseason like obsessing over it. I'm like, I need to like figure out a way to get this like across to the coaches. And like, so I spent a lot of times like meeting with the quarterback coach or the coordinator or the head coach or the offensive line coach or even the center or the quarterback, and like really interacting with like all of their questions and their thoughts and like reasoning for like, okay, why are we not running quarterback sneaks? Like, is there an injury risk? Is there like certain, is it the looks considered not good? Like, is there other reasons? Like we want to, have a mixed strategy. And I attempted to like, use as much data as possible to like answer all their concerns. And for example, like one typical reason was like, okay, we don't want to injure the quarterback. Well, the reality is in something like the last like 700 quarterback sneaks, at least that I had data for, there had been like 2 injuries. And one was like Mahomes a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I was gonna say, once that happens to Mahomes, then all your players.
Yeah, and then that absolutely spooked everybody for sure. But one was Mahomes, which obviously, like, that if there ever was a guy you never would want a quarterback sneak, like, probably Mahomes, because like, just preserve his body as much as possible. But and then like Tom Savage or something like had like a concussion or something one time. But other than that, like actual injuries that led to a player coming out of the game were like basically happening once every 350 snaps or something. It's like, that's like a decent risk reward for like the most efficient play type. But just being able to interact with certain coaches and they'll be like, okay, the offensive line coach says that, if there's 2 guys if there's this front aligns, like we can't run a quarterback sneak. And then being able to use the PFF data to pull up all the times that in the last, 5 to 10 years that front has been presented and a team ran a quarterback sneak anyways. And what was the success rate? And like being able to like almost like debate and like, defend, if you have like a thesis, be able to like fight it for it. And I think that was really useful. And so one thing that, it's not really a secret, but one thing that people had sort of caught on to like partway through the 2017 season is like, we had sort of decided that there were certain like 3rd and 4th down situations that no matter what the defense aligned in, like we were running a quarterback sneak. Like, and like the data was like pretty supportive of that, to just getting the surge and like getting a good snap and, having everyone drive off the ball that you were probably going to convert it anyways. And like, I would like my hair would be like falling out watching other teams, and it would be like 4th and a half yard and they line up in shotgun and like have like a deep passing play or something like that. I'm like, just, it's like a foot, just jam it in there. And just like, like it's, but I think to some degree that thing's closing now too, because now a lot more teams are actually running a lot of quarterback sneaks. And I think that the rate of sneaks has jumped in the last couple of years pretty high, even on like the goal line. I think you see a lot of like quarterback rushing touchdowns more than you did in previous years last year. And I think it's teams realizing they're like, well, we have 1st and 2nd goal on the 1 yard line. Like if we just jam this thing up here, like worst case scenario, it's like 2nd and goal from the 1 or 3rd and goal from the half yard line. So I think
you're less likely to get a hold on a play like that.
Yeah, like a hold, or you see like all these teams are trying to get fancy and like run like some kind of dive flip play from the 1 yard line. Next thing you know, it's 2nd and goal from the 6, or like like just sort of just managing the risk there. It's like, all right, even like a failed quarterback sneak, you're essentially most of like it's incredibly rare for a sneak to get negative yards. So you're probably gaining like half a yard if it's failed or whatever. But that was like,
we had Brady doing it for all these years.
Yeah. And like
Brady, like a positive effect from that. And it kind of proves like athleticism isn't necessarily the most
and I
attribute.
For sure. And just from growing up like a Patriots fan, like I was, I had been biased a little bit from seeing Brady run so many sneaks, and like he's probably in the bottom few least athletic starting quarterbacks in the NFL, maybe like the least. And for him to be so good at that and successful, it's like, all right, he's not doing it because he's not succeeding at such a high rate because he's a freak athlete. Like that is completely false. So like, what is going on? What is their operation? And we sort of like, I'm not going to say stole, but we sort of like copied a few things that New England was doing to like increase the frequency that we were running sneaks. And like, there would be times where like, we felt like we had a very, very high chance of converting, and we sort of were copying like what we thought New England was doing. And that was something that worked out good. But,
did you have data on like ball? I mean, that's something that's come up not looking at sneaks, but looking at these fourth downs specifically that Michael Lopez, who's the
Yeah.
head of data analytics in the NFL, he's shown with the ball tracking, like the exact location and how that there's like selection bias, right? So sneaks are not
Yes.
happening on fourth and a full yard or fourth and I guess you could even be a little bit past a yard and probably still be called 1 yard. They're
Yeah.
happening on fourth and in a foot. So did you account for that sort of stuff? Because
Yes.
I'm sure people complained about that too. I'm not complaining, but maybe that was part
Absolutely.
of it.
No, yeah, that was a big concern. And so like one thing at the time, like we didn't have access to the ball data. But we were fortunate, like in the off season, we'd have a lot of interns, or whether it was me or like additional interns, we would just grind through.
You were just obsessed. You were just tracking.
Well, at one point I had like it was thousands of plays that were like short yardage. And what we were doing is we were subjectively looking at the TV copies and making an assessment, because basically the way that I believe the way their rule keeping, like whatever, the way that they're told to classify plays is basically if it is less than 2 yards, like 2 full yards, it's
right.
1 yard to go.
Okay. Yeah.
So it could be like,
I wasn't sure if it was 1.5 or more.
No, so it'd be like, it could be like clearly like 1 3/4 yards, and that would be marked as 1.
Right.
And it could be 2 inches, and that's marked as 1. So clearly that's a different scenario. And I think
the largest range of any distance is 1 yard. Is in that 1 yard. Yeah. Okay.
Right. Absolutely. So I think what Michael Lopez had found were like there's some range where, say, if it's a few inches, you're looking at like approaching 80% plus conversion rate. And if it's, nearly 2 yards, you're looking at closer to like 55%. Like that's a huge difference.
Yeah.
And so I actually had very similar numbers from like the subjective data. And like, I know in like a perfect world, you're not using too much subjective data, but like when we were subjectively like looking at these TV copies over like maybe like 10,000 short yardage plays, like it did very clearly show up like, okay, as the distance increased, your conversion rates were different. And, what was sort of interesting to me is like a lot of times with the sneaks that you would have teams, gain 2+ yards, like legitimately 2+ yards on a quarterback sneak, even though it's like, so there's like a mindset like, oh, it's only for like a half yard situation or only for a yard, but like the actual distance gains. And that'll be something interesting that I think if people use this ball data for like exact gains, like the exact distance gained on a lot of quarterback sneaks often exceeds 2 yards, sometimes 3 yards. Like I want to say over 50% of them or something were 2+ yards, which would make you think like, hey, teams should be willing to run sneaks in like 3rd and 2s or 2nd and 3, things like that. Like they should be more open to it. And I think you'll probably see that. And I think Buffalo was one team that was starting to do that more with Josh Allen, where he's obviously a big, strong guy, and they would just like jam it forward on 3rd and 2. And they're like, well, we didn't get it, but it's 4th and a half yard now. So we still have an 80% chance of getting this one as well. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah. And like the ball spotting is not the most precise, obviously, we've seen in the
NFL. It's frustrating. There was a few times.
Okay, I have a great idea. I'm surprised no team has been called out for doing this. How come on these like short yardage situations you don't like teach the offensive line to just like, or do they already do this? Do they like crowd the ball a little bit more than they would normally, and then the center does that thing where he picks up the ball and kind of like moves it forward a few inches before snapping it? Or do all teams do that?
All I'll say is if you watch a few TV copies of the Eagles, like you may have seen something like that happen.
Like I'm always like, if you haven't gotten caught for it or you haven't been asked to not do it, then you're not doing it enough, right? Like
there was times, and I'm not kidding you. Like you can pull this up, TV copies. I don't even know it. Is it possible to get the TV copy on like the NFL game film thing? Maybe, but
yeah.
There was times we snapped the ball on 4th and inches or 3rd and inches, and the ball was already a first down. it was like, so if we got stuffed, it was the first down. It was like, this is ridiculous. But the preciseness of the spotting was a problem for me at times when I was like communicating information to Doug, like on 4th downs. I'd be like, the previous play would end, and I would, between like actually looking out on the field and looking at me, like, because I had access to the monitor upstairs. I would often like say it's a play towards a sideline and it looks like it's like a full 2 yards, and I might give him some information like, it's probably a go for it situation. And by the time the ball's like thrown back in to the other referee and spotted, it's like 3 yards for no reason. They just like completely jack up the spot. And I'm like, but Doug, the head coach, really like theoretically would have to quickly make that decision. And like, I don't even it was just sort of weird for me at times. I'm like, actually they spotted it there, but you already decided. Like now it's like, I don't know if this is the right decision.
Yeah.
So that was always kind of an interesting dynamic. I think they have to figure out a way to spot the balls more precisely and then have some kind of, I don't know if it's like copying FIFA or whatever, but having some kind of like goal line technology, because there's nothing more annoying than those plays that are like jammed up right in the interior of the goal line and no one has a clue if it's a touchdown or not. And then the ref defer to whatever was called because they have
you can't see the knee, right? When the knee's down most of the time. So then you're just like going on the original call. Like whatever the original call is, you're never going to have any evidence to reverse it.
Yeah. So if there was any way that they could do, I think, and obviously those are super high leverage plays. If there was any way they could improve on that, that would definitely be helpful, I think, for sure.
Yeah. But one other thing on sneaks. Now that this is, I'm sure what every audience wants is a good half an hour discussion of quarterback sneaks. But how come people don't do the Drew Brees thing more often near the goal line, where the play's dead the moment it crosses the plane? He gets down. I never see him get hit. It seems extremely effective.
You're saying the reach over the top?
Yeah, just reach over the top and pull it back down.
Yeah, I like the reach over the top a lot, but I would say like you really should only be doing it on like,
it was close, right? Yeah.
Well, you should really only be doing it on like third and fourth downs, because a lot of these, even like we would coach our linebackers that like if they do that, go for the ball, like literally go for the punch. So like if you did that on say like a first down or second down, or if you did that out in the open field, like say it's like 4th and inches, at the 30-yard line, and you
not in the open field. I'm only talking about on
I get what you're saying though.
Right.
But for sure, I mean, and Drew was great at that. And I think part of that too is like they had some kind of mechanism, like, all right, if there's two guys in 4-point stances that are like basically have their head in the dirt, like in those A gaps, like preventing a sneak at all costs, but they're like selling out. Like one of the ways that teams really slow down the sneaks is you have these guys that are like defensive tackles who are just basically like dive bombing at the knees of the center. And like, so there's just like no movement going on there.
Yeah.
And, but I mean, Drew killed it, and Drew's not a very big guy. Like you definitely could see more of the bigger quarterbacks who have the longer arms and whatnot. Like they definitely could be doing that more. I think that's an opportunity for sure.
Yeah. I just didn't know how much of it was maybe just like Drew's really good at sense of when to do it and how to protect himself.
Yeah, I think for the most part, when I've seen it, like it was usually when you had guys that were like fairly low in those A gaps.
Yeah.
Because like it like just like diving underneath was like almost impossible in those situations. But I do think
it seemed like it worked every single time I saw.
Yeah, and it's similar to like Brady, where Brady's sneak conversion rate was just outrageous, like 97%. Like Brady was only running sneaks against like certain looks to basically guarantee it was like almost always going to work. But yeah, I think you're onto something there, that it definitely is a little bit of an opportunity, especially if you have like a big guy. Like I in particular, I think New England had like maybe a record amount of sneaks last year with Cam Newton, because that if there ever was a guy that was like borderline impossible to stop on a sneak, like you could have all 11 players just like right in front of the center, and Cam Newton is just such a large guy that like he's gonna get some yards.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about, so you had this like quasi analytics / coaching role. Did that change much as you were progressing through? Did you get more into the coaching side of things then, or was it really kind of like taking that game management? Because I'm really interested in the game management thing, because you mentioned that Doug came over from Andy Reid. Andy Reid famously maybe could use some help on the game management side of things. So how did that exact role develop as you did it change as you progressed?
Yeah, I mean, my first year was more like generally with Doug was more generally classified as like an analyst, but like I was interested in coaching and like I enjoyed it. And I always did feel like the more that I could be with the coaches and the more time I spent with those guys, and the better the relationships I could build with those guys, my credibility and my ability to make an impact would be better. So once I kind of like formally was like a coach, like I think that this pushback that like, oh, he's just like some analytics nerd was like not very valid, when I'm like, I understood the scheme on offense. I understood the scheme on defense. Like I could teach his concept to players and things like that. And I think that really gave me a lot more credibility, that like if I was saying something, it wasn't just some like Ivy League kid just spitting out some meaningless data. So if that makes sense. Like, because I think that
Yeah,
happens
yeah, yeah.
in some degrees
Obviously.
where you have these coaches that are very anti-analytics and they're just like, these guys have no clue what they're talking about. When in reality, like I think there's a lot of like great analysts and they do have good things to say and they just get completely
Well, I
forgotten.
mean, I've always thought. I mean, I guess Howie's actually done a pretty good job with the Eagles because I think he has the ear of the owner that it really helps there. But I always thought that even in football, it might be you need like a Billy Bean sort of guy. Like you need someone who played who then buys in to then like bring it in and really and really do it. Just because of that factor that it's hard to get buy-in
Yeah.
if you're purely just a nerd coming in, basically.
Yeah. I think in particular, like if you look at, I got to know Andrew Berry a little bit because he was with the
Yeah.
Eagles for 1 year. And I think Andrew's a great example. Like he was like a good player in the Ivy League. And, he definitely like understood the football scheme and spent a lot of time. Like he'd call me into his office and ask about certain schemes or ask about, plays that we were running. And like he was very sharp when it came to like football IQ. And also he was incredibly pro analytics. And I think that like, unfortunately for the rest of the league, like Cleveland with Andrew Berry is going to be a very good team for a very long time because he's just a really impressive guy. And in terms of like, a front office guy, like he's just like the total package. And I think that maybe to some degree prior to, Andrew Berry being the GM in Cleveland, like they did have smart people and they did have helpful people, but like him being in that role, like now as like the GM, like definitely helps with the buy-in, from coaching staff and from, player personnel selections and things like that, as opposed to in the past, they had some people there that, maybe were a little bit disconnected from like the football side of things. And
Yeah.
I think it sort of created a situation where there was like hostility between like, a scouting person and a coaching person and like analytics people. And now I think they're kind of like all on the same page. And I think that they're definitely going to be like a model that I think you'll see more teams that are like looking to hire like analytics type of GM people. Like I think they'll be looking at Cleveland in particular and being like, can we emulate what they're doing right now?
Yeah, yeah, it helps to not go 1-31 also. That's you get a
Yes.
little tension. You get a little tension when that happens. So anyways, I derailed it again. So you're moving up, you're able to bridge that path. Let's talk a little bit again about the game management role and really did that evolve over time?
Yeah, to some degree. I mean, I was sort of I guess I sort of had like been put in that role in like 2016, and then I sort of just
How
stayed.
unique do you think it was at that point in time, 2016 in the
Um,
NFL?
some teams are so secretive that you just have no like Ernie Adams just retired, and no one still has any idea like what he
Yeah,
did for,
yeah.
for the
Yeah.
Patriots. But I think it definitely was a low percentage of teams that were
Okay.
doing that, or maybe they had somebody, but they were not really like being utilized. If that makes sense, and
Yeah.
they like existed. But in terms of like actually having a coach that was like very receptive to it, and if it was like a critical down and distance situation, like Doug Pederson wanted to know what I had to say on all that, and like he was going to make his own decision, but he wanted to know what the data was in all those situations, and I think that was fairly unique. Where other times you might have somebody up there, but they're just sort of I don't know, they're not really utilized as frequently as you maybe would expect. But I think now, like at the time, that was fairly rare, and now you have far more teams that are trying to do something like that, just because the NFL is such like a copycat thing. If one team has success and that it becomes like public what they were doing, then all of a sudden everybody wants to like they think it's like the secret to winning or whatever. So it becomes like a common thing.
Or at least a box they have to check, I guess.
Yeah,
They're
for sure.
doing. Yeah, yeah. So during the game, so you were communicating. So how much of the communication was about? Was like, what was your purview? Was it like timeout management sort of stuff? Different calls on fourth down. What else in between all that stuff are we not thinking
Um,
about?
so like I would spend a good amount of time like trying to help out like the game plans on offense and defense, special teams or whatever, throughout the week. And really it'd be like a week, almost like a week in advance, so like it'd be Monday morning or, whatever. Like I would have all this information for the coaches to try to help them. And then I'd like bring my materials with me into the game, and like if something came up that was like holding true from like the data that I'd had going into the game and it sort of was playing out and like happening during the game, like okay, like the Giants are giving up 11 yards per play on play actions or whatever, and then it's in the game, we've called 5 play actions and we have like 112 yards, like I might bring that up and sort of just like mention it, but I wasn't like going to tell the head coach like, hey, you know, call 383 Porky or anything. Like, I'm not gonna like tell him what to do that from like a play call standpoint there. So really like fourth downs, like timeout utilization. I would help out a little. We had another guy that was like kind of a rules expert, and he was sort of like studying the plays for like challenge situations, and I would sort of help him out with like, okay, like is the magnitude of the challenge worth it? Like, okay, they gained 3 yards on 2nd and 7. Like, why are we like, we don't have to challenge it? Or like they gained 32 yards on 3rd down. Like I think, and it's the 3rd quarter. Like I think we want to challenge this type thing. And the other thing too was like accepting and declining penalties, because there is like a ton of like really obscure like options that get presented. Like, okay, it's, you know, 1st and 20 or 2nd and 12 from like what yard line, or it's you're at your own 10, the other team's at their own 10-yard line and there's a penalty on the offense. Like, do we accept or decline the penalty because it's a half the distance of the goal situation? And like sort of giving like Doug some like tangible data from that standpoint of like which of the 2 options would be better there. And then really just because he was like an offensive coach and he was always like, let's score points, let's score touchdowns, whatever. I was definitely trying to help him out with like managing the clock at the end of halves, or being like, hey, you know, we're up by this amount. Like, you know, this really kind of would be classified as more of like a 4-minute situation if possible. Or it's the end of the first half and it's like, all right, we're on the plus 30-yard line and there's 2 minutes left. Like, we don't necessarily need to be in a hurry because, you know, if we take our time these next couple plays, like we're pretty much going to have the last possession of the half. And, you know, we're going to end the half, you know, with 3 or 7 points and they're going to have close to 0. Or if we like go and take a shot from the 30-yard line with 2 minutes left in the half and we score a touchdown, like they're getting a full 2 minutes to try to match us there. So like sort of just helping out with like tempo at the end of halves was something that I was sort of involved with a little bit too.
Well, okay, the end of half stuff I find very interesting because it's really hard because there's like a couple of plays that can happen that dramatically change the whole dynamic. And often, I don't know, it's been my intuition that teams like don't use their timeouts enough or early enough sometimes, because then maybe you can kind of open up what you can do and you don't want to like take them into the half and then have to end up kicking a field goal if you don't want to. But at the same time, you know, very easily you can, it's a small amount of time that can make it a makeable field, allow the other team to get into field goal range on the way back. So how do you think, I mean, is there like a macro philosophy that you've found as far as how you would look at it versus how teams are doing it? Or does it really just depend on a play by play, down by down, factoring everything in, one play to the next, what you're going to do?
I think just from a big picture standpoint, I was particularly as somebody that was like coaching with the defense and everything, like I'm not going to say a bias, but like I was always very aware of like, are we being too aggressive with the timeouts to the point where the other team could have a meaningful possession? And I really was like looking at it like, who are we playing against? Like, how do they operate at the end of the half? Like, if they get the ball back with 30 seconds, are they kneeling it out? Are they trying to do something? Are we going up against Pat Mahomes or Aaron Rodgers? Because I really don't want to leave them any time, like if possible. So for me, I sort of felt like at sometimes teams are maybe a little bit rushing a little bit too early. Like this, like there's like this whole like perspective around like, oh, it's a 2-minute warning, we have to like rush. And really, like if you look at teams like New England or like how Brady sort of operates, like they were kind of taking their time, like down towards until around like a minute, like, and just simply running plays that work and not worrying about like scoring as quickly as possible, just, you know, managing the clock there. And I've sort of found that like somewhere around 1 minute is where, in a perfect world, like say it's the end of the first half, like ideally we're hoarding our timeouts, so we have 3 there. And if you're on offense, like somewhere around a minute is where you would like start using your timeouts on offense. And that way, but some teams are doing it like calling a timeout at like 150 or whatever, 147, and all of a sudden they call a couple timeouts, they throw some incompletions, and they're punting at 120 to the other team, and like that the other team has 1:20 left and has plenty of time for like a possession. And so many, I mean, you can see just like that final 2 minutes of the first half must be near like the highest scoring period of the game, just because all the 2-minute drives and everything like that. And I was always like, if we're punting, like hopefully, this team has something like under 30 seconds and, doesn't have all their timeouts. But it would get fairly complicated, like very complicated at times, because it would be like, all right, it's like 1st and 10 from the minus, 20 yard or your own 20-yard line. And it would be like, all right, if we gain this amount of yards, we want to be on the ball, hurry up. If we gain this amount of yards, we want to huddle. If we have a sack, we want to huddle and not call timeout. If we have that, like there at times I would be like trying to present like 3 or 4 different scenarios. So it would get fairly complicated. But at times it worked out pretty good, I guess. But for the most part, like I do think to some degree, like if I was managing the 2-minute situations at the end of halves, like I would lean more towards doing whatever I can to make sure that my team had the last meaningful possession. And just being like, okay, you know what? If in a worst case scenario, we're attempting a field goal, best case scenario, we're scoring a touchdown, but I don't want to be in a situation where the other team is scoring a touchdown or even attempting a field goal. Does that make sense?
No, that definitely makes sense. You know what? This discussion reminds me of a situation now that the decision got a lot of shit basically for the fact that I'm going back to the playoffs here. You may know what I'm going to be talking about here, but there was, I guess it's the 2018 season, but I think this game was against the New Orleans Saints in 2019. It's officially 2019 in the playoffs. There was a big question mark as to, maybe you can, I don't know if you remember, I didn't bring this up to you in advance to prep sort of this play, but there was a play that was snuck in where it was intercepted ball to Alshon Jeffrey, snuck in before the 2-minute warning. There was a lot of like, why get this play out before the 2-minute warning, being that it looks like it was on the 27-yard line for New Orleans.
Down 6, I think.
One timeout left, I believe. And then I'm looking at this. So sorry, I don't know if you had nightmares about this for a while, but to bringing this up. But is there anything that people were missing thinking about this, or were you kind of the mindset, hey, maybe we should have taken the 2-minute warning now?
I'm not going to question the coach, because I think that he called a good play and the guy was open and he had his reasons.
Right,
like
it was a drop that when it was
like
right.
About as brutal as a drop from a guy that is like incredibly reliable. The ball was thrown very well. Like in terms of like play design and selection, like I think that the coach felt that getting off one more play, that the other team was a little bit like on their heels and that they could have a successful play there. At the time, I was like sharing. I'm like, we probably could take this to 2-minute warning. Yeah. And, he made a decision that like, he felt like that was at the time, like that they had a good play. They thought they were going to get an easy completion and, move the ball, whatever it was, like 7 more yards or something. And he was right. I mean, like it was wide open and then just the unluckiest thing happened. But I think like
it was 2nd and 10, it looks like, on that one also. So you needed some yards. Like you couldn't okay.
And I think he just at the end of the day, like that's a good example of just like, it wasn't, Doug's a great coach and like probably the most pro analytics coach that the NFL has ever had. And at the time, like, I was sharing information, but that didn't mean that like he was going to absolutely do everything that I said. Like that wasn't really my role. My role was to just sort of like share information to like help complement his decision making. And it just, the way it played out was like just very unfortunate. But to like give you another example of just sort of like how sometimes things, played out really well for us was like when we were in the Super Bowl and prior to the Philly special, like I was sort of emphasizing them like, hey, we don't want to waste the time out here to call this play. There was like 30 seconds left in the first half or whatever. Cause like I was always like, hey, if we go for this at the 1 or 2 yard line and we don't get it, but we have 3 timeouts, like they're going to have to, do something, or we could get the ball back around like the 40 or 50 and, kick a field goal or something at the end of the half, maybe. And but like because there was like a little bit of discussion, and Doug wanted to like think about it, and there was like players complaining about a pass interference the previous play, like we ended up like calling a play and then not really having enough time to call to like, we probably could have ran the play, but Doug didn't feel good about it, so he called timeout. And Nick Foles comes over and they discuss the Philly special thing, and then like sure enough, like it worked out pretty well. And so like I think it was like sort of an example of just like, sometimes these coaches have a good feel of like, maybe, we line up in a certain formation and they realize like, oh, okay, like the nickel's there and the safety's there. Like this isn't the coverage that we want to run this play against. Like I'm going to use a timeout. And then I think that definitely factors in a lot of times. And again, I don't want it to sound like I like question Doug on the Saints thing. Like,
Yeah.
At the end of the day, like the probability that receiver that's making like $10 million a year drops like a wide open pass with like no contesting, like has to be less than like 3%. So like it didn't work out at the time and everything, but I think in general, like it's definitely fun to like look back and like look at all these obscure situations that occur at the end of halves and just like how things can maybe play differently. I do think a lot of times teams are just like way too conservative about not using their timeouts, and they're on offense and all of a sudden they're rushing and they have 1 or 2 timeouts left and they're like taking them into the half and they're not even able to kick a field goal, or something goes wrong, and I think like definitely teams kind of mangle some of these situations, and it's like almost like cringeworthy bad at times. So I think for the most part with the Eagles, we kind of avoided like catastrophic timeout mistakes, but I think even on a weekly basis, I mean, I think you still see different things happen that like pretty clearly could be classified as like a mistake.
Yeah. Well, this comes to a broader thing here too, especially when you have so many coaches who are now play callers. Like, are head coaches just doing too much? Are they doing too much? They have too much like in game, in the moment processing. I mean, think about it. If someone's like, think about these 2-minute things, right? You're like, should I use a timeout? What play should we be running? Everything else that's going into it. It's like, what's the score? What all the different permutations for what can happen going forward. Is there just too much that the head coach is responsible for?
Yeah, I think that for sure with the guys that are play callers, it makes it really complicated. And it was like a convenient situation for me just because Doug was, as like a new head coach, he was like receptive to like doing things different. He wasn't like stuck in his old ways of like, this is how we're going to do things. So like for the most part, he sort of like delegated a lot of like timeout and fourth down and 2-point conversion and penalty like responsibilities to like for me to like share that information at that time, or like leading up to that situation. So a lot of times it'd be like as the previous play was going on, or like as we're breaking the huddle after he's already called the previous play, I'm like sharing information of like, okay, if this outcome occurs in the play, this is what we probably want to do. If this outcome occurs, and sort of just like setting it up so that he doesn't need to sit there and like waste 10 seconds pondering what to do next or anything, particularly at these end of half situations where like every second could be really valuable. And even then, like one thing we tried to emphasize with the fourth downs is like, if we were going to decide to go for it or not, like Doug was going to decide that fairly quickly, as opposed to these teams that waste like 17 seconds deciding, and then they're late breaking the huddle and then they waste the timeout. And it's like, you almost canceled out the value of going for the fourth down because you blew a timeout. So I think we had a pretty good process in place where, it definitely helped that like in that Super Bowl season, we were converting a lot of the fourth downs. And I think that gave him a lot of confidence to just keep doing it. And like, he certainly wasn't going to slow down too much. So that definitely was helpful. And really just, like we would talk about situations that came up around the league. So like I think he was confident that I was prepared, and I knew that at the end of the day, like he was going to do what he thought was best for the team, but he wanted to hear what I had to say. And I think it was like a great relationship, and it allowed for us to have success for sure.
What when you're trying to like translate the level of confidence that you have in what's going on, like you can't just say, you know what, I don't really know what we should do here. Or maybe you can't, maybe you can't say that.
Yeah.
Maybe that's okay to say that. But like sometimes it is that, right? Sometimes it's like, do you have a coin available? Like maybe that's how you're going to figure it out. So how do you translate that through? Because you don't want to come off as overconfident, right? And give the coach the wrong impression of what's going on. But at the same time, if you're hedging a lot, maybe no one's going to listen to what you have to say anyway.
I would always try to, frame things like, if it was sort of getting into like a close call situation, I would sort of, and I think Doug was cool with me like giving my judgment on like based on the factors that were going on in the game, and like, hey, this is probably a field goal, but it's not the end of the world if we go for it. Like it's sort of, and then one thing with the fourth downs that
I like that you're talking him out of going for it. A lot of times there's like the analytics guys like, hey, Doug, we don't have to go for it.
Yeah, I know I mentioned this I mentioned this to you before we the other day or whatever, but like Doug wanted to go for the 4th and 6 at the end of the game at the Super Bowl. And I had to convince him. I'm like, Doug, we're not like please do not go for this. This would be the most catastrophic mistake of your entire career. We're going to fail. And then we're going to be up by 5 with Tom Brady just marching down the field with plenty of time. And they won't even let me back in Philly. I'm going to be like Walter White in Breaking Bad. And I'm going to be in witness protection in a cabin in New Hampshire because they're going to burn the city down. And like, that's like what was that was one of the few times I'm like, Doug, please, like I'm begging.
I think everyone has that image burned in of like Scott Norwood wide right, like missing that field goal at the end of the game. I mean, I think that also factored in to the Shanahan decision with the Eagles against the Patriots is like, I don't think you want to kick that field goal, even though it was like, it's kind of a gimme, like anything under 50 yards is almost a gimme nowadays. But yeah, I think it's hard to say we're going to kick that field goal sometimes because it's like really out of your hands at that point.
Yeah, for sure. It's that was one of the I tried to like, I think I had like a pretty good composure and I tried to avoid like getting overly stressed on situations. And like, I sort of believed in like the data that we had and all that, but that was one of the few times that, like I'm in the Super Bowl and there's 103 million people watching. It's nearly like, and I don't blame Doug. I mean, he had basically that like game plan he had probably should go in the Hall of Fame for like how legendary it was. He's going up against like the best coach in NFL history, scores 41 points. He's running trick plays on 4th downs. Like that was just with a backup quarterback, like backup tackle. Like it was just legendary. And like realistically, he probably had some trick play cooked up that would have worked anyways. But like from a data perspective, like if we actually had gone for that, it would have probably been a very bad decision. Like,
hey guys, I want you to also think about not just this podcast, but other PFF podcasts that are available. We have the 2-for-1 Drafts podcast with Austin Gale and Mike Renner. We have the Chris Collinsworth podcast, and of course the PFF Forecast with Eric Eager and George Jahuri for different gambling and also fantasy related stuff with Ian Hartitz and the PFF Fantasy Football Podcast. The fantasy football season's here, everyone. For just $9.99, you can get access to our draft guide, player rankings, including my own, cheat sheets, everything else that you need right now. $9.99 at pff.com. Before we get into the next segment, I want to give a shout out to our friends at Fantrax. Fantrax free fantasy football league manager is the most customizable, easy to use, and feature-rich platform in the entire industry. You can put player salary and contract options, bonuses of different types that you don't normally have, auto-generate player salaries for your league. If you're coming from another site, no problem. Fantrax can import any of your current leagues completely free. Set up a free account right now with promo code PFF at fantrax.com/PFF and get a chance to win a trip to a regular season game this year for you and your entire league, plus $6,000. That is promo code PFF at fantrax.com/PFF. Pacquiao versus Uguayas this weekend, and DraftKings Sportsbook, America's top-rated sportsbook app, is offering 100-to-1 odds on a punch being landed at any point during the fight. That sounds pretty good. That's right. Bet $1 on either fighter, and if a punch lands during the fight, you will cash $100 in free credits. Download the top-rated DraftKings Sportsbook app now and use promo code PFF when you sign up to turn $1 into $100 in free credits when you bet on either fighter to win and a punch is landed during the fight. Place your bet and watch the fist fly this weekend. That's PFF Promo code PFF, turn $1 into $100 in free credits. Only at DraftKings Sportsbook. Must be 21 or older. New Jersey, Indiana, and Pennsylvania only. New customers only. Restrictions apply. See DraftKings.com/sportsbook for details. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or in Indiana, 1-800-9-WITH-IT. In these uncertain times, life is full of questions like, when should I start thinking about life insurance? But however difficult these questions may be, Western and Southern can help you answer them. Backed by over 130 years of experience, together we can look ahead to leave the unknown behind. Western and Southern Financial Group. Life insurance, retirement, and investments. Compensated endorser. Products issued by member companies of Western and Southern Financial Group, Cincinnati, Ohio. We also mentioned, maybe we can talk a little bit more about the story stuff, because you also mentioned as part of the Forbes article, and I'm going to talk about this whole go for two, up 8 thing, because it became a thing. And I believe, I'm not 100% sure, but you tell the story about how you mentioned it once and then you ended up doing it later on. I think when you ended up doing it, I think it may have been the first time that a team had done it for, I don't even know how long. It didn't get a lot of hype because it was a Sunday early game or something like that.
We ended up losing the game, so it got a little bit, and the analytics people picked up on it. But
the Giants did it on Monday night, not too long thereafter, and that's when it was like all over the place. Right. But anyway, so tell maybe the story of when you were first mentioning it, because it's one of these situations where it's a little opaque, the concept, but it's like such a huge advantage that it seems weird that no one would have done it earlier. So to maybe talk about that.
So I think in that like 2017 offseason, like I had met with Doug, we talked about it a lot, like in terms of, really trying to like ramp up the 2-point conversions and like trying to pretty much follow like analytics on all those situations. And he was all on board. And part of the problem was like, he hadn't necessarily shared it with like everyone on the staff that we were going to like try to do like -8, -4, -11. Like we were planning on going for
what about -4? Because people are not doing -4.
We hold on. We went for -4 last year. Look it up. And Doug got absolutely crucified because we failed. And like the local media, like pretty much had pitchforks. Like he's the worst coach in football history. It's like, look, he won the Super Bowl doing all this stuff. And now he does it one time. And it really didn't make that much of a difference in the game at all. And he got crushed. But so we did it with 5 minutes left in the third quarter against, I think, the Giants this last year. We did not get it. And with that amount of time remaining, it was kind of like a borderline situation. And I wish it came up with like at the start of the fourth or something like that, where it was a little bit more clear of like a win. But anyway,
so the philosophy on that being like, it's not necessarily much better to be up by 3 to be down by 3 than to be down by 4, right?
And I think definitely you have this sense where like teams are like losing by 3 and they're like playing for a field goal to some degree at the end of the game, and like having the security. It's like, so you're playing to like go to overtime to have like a 50% chance of win, as opposed to like if you're down by 6, you're down by 4, things like that. Like you're playing for a touchdown at the end, which is really more optimal. I mean, there was times like we'd be in situations up by 3 and I'm like, we should almost go for like pretty much all these situations rather than go up by 6. Like if we're playing like an elite quarterback, I'm like, I don't want to be up by 6 against them. Like I want them to be playing for a field goal. So we might as well be even extra aggressive, or say it's like, I don't know, like 4th and 8 from like the 20-yard line or something. And we just sit there and say, you know what, if we're up by 3 versus up by 6 here, like it's like, we just don't want Pat Mahomes or Aaron Rodgers or somebody like that playing for a touchdown at the end of the game. So if there's any way we can ice the game with, going for it, or at the very least, have them in a situation where they're almost like hamstringing themselves, like going for a field goal, I think there's definitely like an inefficiency there.
Wait, kids, this is a question that I've thought about, especially when in terms of the going for it going for 2 down 4, is that like part of, so you're looking, it's a data informed decision, right? So part of the data is saying you as the team that would be down 3 after kicking the field goal are going to be too conservative if you get the ball back again, maybe accepting the field goal rather than pushing yourself to go for the touchdown, which then only leads to overtime, so it's not as valuable. But if you know that you're not that team, or you think that you can be more aggressive than what all those other teams were in the past, does that throw off the data in a way
Yeah.
that maybe it's not worth it in
No,
a
it's
way.
definitely a complicated issue. And
Yeah.
I was always trying to advocate for like, all right, look, we're losing by 3. Please do not play for a field goal. Like, let's play
Yeah.
like we're like down by 6. Like, let's try to score and win because we don't want to go to overtime. But it was hard because between the players, like the coaches, like it just, that is something that's like not typical for them. Like, and it's just the way that they think about it. It's like, oh, we'll attempt a field goal. We'll be fine. We'll be down 3. And well, first of all, like half the time the field goals that you're attempting are like 45, 50 yards. And like, they're really, people like think that field goals like go in 100% of the time if you attempt them. Sometimes it's just like,
Yeah.
there's a lot of probabilities that are not great there. I think, yeah, really getting your team to the mindset, like in an optimal world, if you just got your team to the mindset of like, we're attempting to get a touchdown here, that would help out a ton. And that, I mean, that happens like with the end of the game situations, like you score a touchdown and you're down 1. Like, well, if you like went for 2 and there's 2 minutes left and you got it, then the other team is incentivized to go for a touch or to get in field goal range to kick a field goal to win, as opposed to, and they're going to use all 4 downs, as opposed to like if you are down, you're down by 1 at the end of the game and you kick an extra point, then the other team is incentivized to sort of, they're not going to go for 4th downs if they're at their own like 20, 30, 40 yard line if the game is tied, you know what I mean? So, and then they're a lot more, they're a little bit more disincentivized to be like really aggressive to get in field goal range to win. And I think that that's like beneficial for sure. So, cause I know like the analytics community is like, hey, if you score a touchdown with around 2 minutes left to be down 1, like you really should not go for 2.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's weird that ends up happening sometimes more often. Well, I guess we can go back to the discussion, which I derailed again. But like there are some coaches who will not want to go for 2 down 8, but then they'll say, "Well, maybe I'll go for 2 at the very end of the game when
Right.
when I'm down 1," and which doesn't quite make any sense. But anyway, so you said Doug. Let me set the frame again since I blew it up. So Doug knew about it, but maybe the other guys didn't quite know what was going on the staff when you were discussing these things.
Right. Yeah. So we had kind of spent time with it. I mean, I'd sort of show them the data. Like I'd print out the 538 did like a great article about it. I don't know if you ever saw that.
Yeah. Benjamin Morris, I believe.
Yeah. I literally print out the article and like walk them through it. And I'm like, this makes a lot of sense. This matches up with this win probability model that we have, obviously at the end of the day, like if you choose to, kick in these situations, it's not the end of the world, but this is an opportunity that we possibly could gain an advantage. And he was like, let's do it. Like, sounds good. So the situation came up in Kansas City and I like brought it up on the headset when we were beginning this drive. And like a couple of the offensive coaches were just like freaking out. They're like, you're reading your chart wrong. Like, that's completely wrong. Like, what are you talking about? And it was guys that like been coaching for a long time. And I'm like, it was sort of an awkward situation because I was like trying to be respectful to them. But I'm like, like, this is what Doug wanted to do. So I'm just trying to, share the information with him. And ultimately, I think these people were like sort of drowning me out. They're like, no, we definitely got to kick an extra point here. And then so after the game, like the next day we talked and I'm like, I'm trying my best to like, give you the information that I think you want to hear. And like, I know we kind of prepare for the situation, but like these other coaches clearly like weren't on board with that. And I don't really know what to do if that happens again. Like if I tell you about a 4th down and then they're all saying no, like I'm just going to give you the data information and let you like make your best decision, but I don't really know how to handle this. And so he sort of just like sat down with some of the other coaches and he's like, look, like I wanted to go for 2 there. Like I've prepared for the situation. Me and Ryan talked about it. Like just let him do his thing. Like I'm going to make the decision at the end of the day, but just like you guys have your jobs, you're a position coach, you're a coordinator, but like he has his job. This is his responsibility in the game. And just like, I believe in what he's sharing with me and we've prepared for it. So just like, if you guys can just respect that, that would be good. And from that moment on, like, it was really helpful because, it was like, I'd speak on the headset and rather than be like a debate or anything, it was more just like sharing the information. Then Doug could kind of like digest it and think about it. Or he could ask questions like, wait, is that situation or that? And I'm like, yeah, that's the one that we talked about down 4 or whatever. And I think that was really good for just like showing like confidence in me. And like, it helped me like respect him so much more. Cause like, he was basically like standing up for me because I think the direction that things could have gone at that moment could have been like fairly downhill with like analytical buy-in. if I just like got drowned out in that case. So that was good.
Wait, so when you're showing them, when you're pitching them on this, like I remember when I had written something about it and I tried to do this very crude, like, okay, if you score, then you have this probability, and if you don't, just to give an example of like the most likely scenario in which this ends up benefiting you as a team. Did someone like Doug need something like that, or could you just put something in front of him with a model with some numbers, and he's like, "Go for it, yeah, great, let's do it," sort of thing.
I think he was, as like an offensive coach, he was always like very receptive to it. Like, and he was like, sometimes like he didn't necessarily worry about the details of it. And he was like, sounds good to me. Like more points, cool. Like I get to call more plays. All right, that's fun.
Yeah.
And I'll say I've dealt with other coaches that like they wanted every detail of everything that you were doing, every assumption, because they wanted to find out where you were screwed up. Like,
yeah. I mean, like, even in a situation like that, there are 100 different ways that it can play out. Right. Even it's not as simple as they don't score, you score 2 touchdowns. Like there are all these other scenarios that end up happening where it could be, it could be it could hurt you basically in a different scenario.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I would sort of try to, I think you can also like overwhelm coaches by just like being overly complicated because like obviously for even explaining that situation, like it could be just something that with somebody that doesn't have a background in this stuff, like it could just be too much. And they're like, all right, I don't know what the hell's going on. Like, I'm just going to do what every other coach in NFL history has done. And I'm going to kick a field or I'm going to kick an extra point here. So I think just trying to like be efficient and, like straightforward and simple with the explanations as much as possible was helpful. And if there were more questions to like sort of, I guess like walk through, how those questions came up and like what are some answers for them. I also think from my perspective that like having TV copy examples of things that came up in games was always like really helpful so that like the coaches could see like, all right, this team did this, like this is how maybe we could do this situation differently. This is this situation and like this is how things played out from that moment. And I think just being able to see exactly how a team did something rather than just like some text written printout of like, hey, do this. I think just seeing actual film like matching up to it was like really helpful for like buy-in purposes.
Yeah. You mentioned here how the media, right? So like the NFL media generally is insane. Philly, I assume, is like next level as far as some of the reactions there. So it sounds like Doug was pretty good about just blocking it out in what he was doing. But how much of an effect did you think that had on these, like bringing up these ideas, right? That are going to, they're going to at least be written about, right? And it's kind of like with the Alshon Jeffrey thing. Like, I mean, the problem was he dropped the pass, right? The problem wasn't necessarily that, but then when these things happen, it gets attributed back to the fault of the first thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that it was so valuable, and I mentioned this earlier, that the owner was so receptive, and the owner had very clearly communicated to Doug, like, I believe in this stuff. I believe if you do this stuff, like, yes, you're going to get roasted if things don't work, but I am confident that, like if we keep doing this stuff, it's going to work. And to have that reassurance that like from the person that is writing your paycheck, that like you're doing a good job, I think was really important for us to be able to do that. And I think that at the end of the day, like having success, even in like small samples of plays, was incredibly valuable for our team to be able to, do that and win games and to kind of push away some of the critics. So like the 2017 season, for example, like we had like a disproportionate amount of like 4th and inches plays and we converted every single one of them. And like, so like when people would talk about our 4th down conversion rate, it was like juiced up by the fact that there was a bunch of plays that are going to convert 80+% of the time anyways. And so like, but that benefited Doug because like, oh, Doug goes for a lot of 4th downs and he's 17 of 26 or whatever it was. And if we had like a lot of 4th and 3s or 4th and 2s that, may have from an analytics perspective been go for it situations and we went for them and failed, like, I think that the critics would be much stronger. And also I think that he would be a little bit more hesitant to continue to do it. And that sort of actually played out this last year. Like we planned on being like pretty much the most aggressive team in NFL history this last year. But the reality is that our pass offense was not good. Like
Yeah,
as the season played
that's an
out,
understatement. Yeah.
it was very, like, whatever metrics you want to look at it, it was realistically clearly below average. And a lot of these like 4th and 3+ situations are pretty clearly like pass situations. And we had some that we went for and we didn't convert them. And that was like a case where, the coach had to kind of factor in, like, realistically, you know what, like, the identity of this team, like, I have to sort of manage field position a little bit more than in the past, because, realistically, an average situation might say go for this 4th and 3 from the +45, but, I don't feel great about it. And that was tough for me at times, because, like, I guess this last season we sort of went against like analytics on 4th downs more frequently than any other year, which is fine. But like, it was just different for me. But I think it was like a smart decision from Doug, because he sort of embraced the fact and like was aware of the fact that the pass offense had like dropped off. And realistically, if we had a 50% chance of converting, if we were an average team, like, maybe we had a 45% chance because we were struggling. And so I think that's like a good example of just like, having a coach that sort of has to like use their instincts and their, judgment and feel for how the team is doing to sort of make the best decision for the team at the time. And I think that, I would have loved to be, working for a offense that was like top 3 in the NFL every single year, like a Mahomes thing or Drew Brees or Brady or whatever, because I think so many more of those like 4th and medium situations that you could, be going for, you probably convert better than average. And then it convinces the coach to go for those. And it's sort of like a circular effect there.
Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah. I feel like Kansas City in particular, you just wish that they were kind of like always going. They could probably almost do the always go for it sort of thing here. Okay, so closing out here, maybe just one more thing. So now looking out into the future. So you came into the Eagles organization, like you said, we had Chip Kelly, which was kind of like moving a little bit light years ahead in certain aspects, and other aspects it's evolved into it. How do you see things playing out with teams and this kind of analytics coaching relationship going forward? Is the way you think you were doing it in Philly kind of like the right way to do it, to have someone who has a dual role like yourself, or is there ability to bring in even more people, which maybe people wouldn't want, like a horde of nerds all getting involved in the game management stuff? How do you see that developing?
I think to some degree, like having one person, or just having like a consistent message for the head coach or for coordinators, I think that's important, because I think sometimes things can get muddied up if you have like 7 different analysts that have different conclusions and things like that. So I think that definitely, if you look at some of the teams that have had success with this stuff, like, it's sort of, I mean, there's definitely like relationships in the building, but at the end of the day, like, there's sort of like one person that's sort of tasked with like a role, like Daniel Stern or Ernie Adams or Mike Frazier, whoever at like different teams, like George and John and with the Colts. And like having, definitely having people, I think that, just have a great relationship with the head coach is really important. And if the relationship isn't great, like, I know of at least one team where like there was like an analyst and they were helping out during the games, and, they just didn't have a good relationship with the head coach. And it just was like a train wreck, because like they weren't on the same page. And I think to some degree, like, it was beneficial for me to like be classified as a coach and just sort of like be known that, like, all right, if the head coach doesn't succeed, like, like my job's at risk as well, because like I have skin in the game here, as opposed to a lot of these teams, like, they're just taking like a front office staff member and like plugging them up there. And I think sometimes there can be like a little bit of animosity or division, thinking like, well, they're not responsible for like, if we do go for this or go for that, like, they're not the one that has to go meet with the media, or they're not the one that, like they're not being held accountable for their communication and their choices, as opposed to like, I felt like it was kind of nice that I sort of had like skin in the game, that like, if things don't work out, it's not great. That being said, I definitely would, be looking to, really invest as much as possible in guys that, or people that have skills that could add to your team. Like, using the next gen GPS stuff is like awesome. I think some of the stuff that ESPN's been doing with like run block win rate, like pass block win rate. I think some of that stuff is awesome. Like some of the stuff with sort of classification of coverages and like heat maps and things. I think it's really useful. And I think you'll see more and more like stuff getting factored into game planning. Like for us, for example, like we looked at the like GPS tracking of like moving at the snap. And part of this was like motivated because ESPN had done something about it using the GPS data where like, yes, like teams that had players moving at the snap, like there was some interesting challenges that are presented to defenses and like, how can we factor that in more? And I think you'll see more and more where like teams are like quickly looking like, all right, what are the best concepts against like cover 3 seam, or what's the best concepts against cover 4, and being able to use the data and have like plays classified through that, or having this front or this coverage, like here's a blocking scheme, or here's a run concept that maybe we're not running that we could consider against that. And I definitely think that there's still a lot of like busy work being done in the NFL that could be like replicated or just replaced by people that have skills to just run queries, or even just use things like Pro Football Focus, where you guys give us so much like useful data. And I don't know if you have a relationship with every team or every college team, but like if you don't use Pro Football Focus at this point, like you're insane. Like the amount of time that it takes. Like I was using that stuff every single day, and that's not just like some stupid plug. Like I'm just and at some points I was like, there was things I would like ask like Mike Parker or different people, and like it would later like end up on the site. And I'm like, wait, maybe I shouldn't have said that, because like I thought it was like valuable. And now like every team in the league has this information. Like I got to like keep some of these things as like a secret or something. But I think that just definitely just relationships with like staff members is really important. Like, and even just individual coaches, like is it a special teams coordinator, an offensive coordinator, a defensive coordinator? Even if you have like one person that's like not receptive, it's like really tough. Like, because just if they don't want anything to do with numbers, and it sort of creates like a strange situation. I think you're going to continue to see this stuff increasing. I think for like 4th downs and 2-point conversions, like you will probably see teams go like more similar to what we were doing in Philly, like running more 2-point conversions. But like we were kind of maxed out in terms of like how frequently we're going for it. Like you're not going to start like going for 2, like down 3 for no reason, like weird stuff. And like we kind of were just like reaching a peak there. And I think for some of the 4th downs, like some teams, I think this last year went for some 4th downs that were like borderline clearly too aggressive. And I think as teams like come up with 4th down models, it's maybe the most interesting problem right now is like trying to make some kind of like error adjustment for expected points or win probability. Because it's like, all right, how far back is your like win probability model factoring in, or how far back is your expected points model going? And like, how are you dealing with the game changing or certain variables that like change the dynamic? Like one thing that wasn't really talked about too often publicly that made a big difference was, the kickoff moving, the touchback moving to the 25-yard line, because all of a sudden when you're making a decision of like touchdown versus field goal, the average starting field position went from something like the 21 after a touchdown or field goal to the 25. And that's like an expected points difference. And that actually makes you like lean more towards going for touchdowns, because like the ratio between touchdowns and field goals was changing there. That makes sense.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because you're going to make the field goal more often, so you'd be kicking off more often, I guess, right?
Well, no. So basically, think if in the past we might have used something like a touchdown on like a decision-making model was worth 6.6 points, because the touchdown is worth whatever 7, and then the expected points of the 1st and 10 from the 21 is 0.4. So like the touchdown changes the game state by 6.6 in your favor, and a field goal would change the game state by 2.6 in your favor because of that same dynamic. But if the ball is now at the 25, and if offenses are getting better and you're using a different expected points model, all of a sudden a touchdown at the 1st and 10 from the -25 is worth 0.8 to the other team.
Yeah.
Expected points versus 0.4 in the past. Like that's all of a sudden you're looking at 6.2 expected points versus 2.2 expected points.
Right. So proportionally, like or relatively, it goes up.
Yes,
the touchdown value of the touchdown goes up. Right. Okay.
Yeah. So I think you'll see from that standpoint, like more teams going for 4th and 2s and 4th and 3s because of that dynamic. But we'll see how I guess it plays out.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's all moving forward, and thanks to you, and thanks to the Eagles, and thanks to winning that Super Bowl, and thanks to convincing him not to go for it there on 4th and 6. So that was helpful. Well, Ryan, this has been excellent. I know that you're going to be doing more kind of like behind the scenes stuff here, but I'm hoping to see you and Doug back on the sidelines again next season. I guess, like I said, you're going to be kind of doing this behind the scenes and more, not too much stuff to plug, but everyone should check out the Forbes article that we talked about called how the NFL uses analytics according to the lead analyst of a Super Bowl champion, which features a lot of quotes and analysis from Ryan there. And you also mentioned before the show you might be getting on Twitter, so welcome to the cesspool there, and I'll make sure to send your handle out to everyone once you are.
Yeah, I might join for about 15 minutes and delete it, so we'll see. But I unfortunately I had a Twitter in high school with the Ryan Paganetti username, and it was like using like a high school email that I no longer have access to, and like the only tweet I ever sent was like I asked Shaq how much he could bench, and like it just sits there forever. And I'd reach out to Twitter, and they're like, "Yeah, you're not allowed to touch this. Like it's associated with this email." And I'm like, "All right, thanks, guys." Like, so I'm gonna have to come up with a different username.
Well, of all the possible things you could have tweeted out at that age, at that time, not too bad, not too bad. Well, once again, thanks everyone for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this, and only a few more weeks till the NFL season, and I'll be talking to everyone next week. Thanks.
Thank you.